Every week, you boil bones for broth, pull them out of the pot, and throw them in the trash. Chicken bones, pork bones, beef knuckles, gone. You might even feel good about it, like you squeezed every last bit of value out of your groceries. But here is what nobody tells you. What you just threw away contains more phosphorus per gram than most fertilizers sitting on the shelf at your local garden center. In 1815, after the Battle of Waterloo, European merchants didn't rush to the battlefield to collect weapons or uniforms. They collected bones, hundreds of tons of human and animal bones, loaded onto carts, shipped to grinding mills, and sold to farmers across Britain and Germany as the most prized soil amendment of the era. Farmers paid real money for those bones because they understood something we have completely forgotten: that roasted ground bone is one of the most bioavailable sources of phosphorus and calcium that any soil can receive. 200 years later, you are boiling those same bones in your kitchen every single week and throwing them into a black plastic bag headed for a landfill while spending $15 at the garden store on a processed bag of bone meal made from the exact same raw material, just handled by a factory instead of your hands. This video is going to show you exactly what your grandparents knew, what the fertilizer industry spent decades making you forget, and how a 10-minute process over a charcoal fire turns your kitchen waste into one of the most powerful phosphate sources your fruit trees have ever tasted. The relationship between bones and soil is older than agriculture itself. Archaeologists excavating Neolithic farming settlements across the Fertile Crescent, modern-day Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, found evidence that early farmers were deliberately burying animal bones around crop roots as far back as 8000 BCE. They didn't have laboratories. They didn't have soil tests. But they noticed something undeniable. Plants grown near bone refuse grew taller, fruited heavier, and survived dry seasons better than plants grown in untreated ground. That observation, passed down through generations of farmers across every continent, became one of the foundational secrets of pre-industrial agriculture. By the time the Roman Empire was at its height, bone-based soil amendment was standard practice across the Mediterranean. Roman agricultural writers, including Columella in his first-century text De Re Rustica, described the grinding of burned bones into powder and working it into orchard soil before planting. This was not folk superstition. This was documented agronomic knowledge, refined over centuries, practiced by some of the most productive farming civilizations in human history. Then came 1815. The Battle of Waterloo left somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 men dead across a few square miles of Belgian farmland. Within months, British and Dutch merchants arrived, not as historians, not as mourners, but as businessmen. Contemporary accounts from the port of Hull document shipments of human and animal bones arriving from the European continent throughout 1816 and 1817, destined for the bone mills of Yorkshire. A single grinding mill in the town of Doncaster processed an estimated 30,000 tons of bones per year at the peak of this trade. Farmers across northern England and Scotland were paying premium prices per ton because they knew exactly what those bones could do for their wheat fields and apple orchards. The bone trade expanded rapidly through the 1820s and 1830s, with ships returning from South America carrying bones excavated from the pampas grasslands of Argentina, ancient bison and cattle bones pulled from the soil and shipped 5,000 miles to feed the nutrient-hungry farmland of industrial Britain. By 1840, Britain alone was importing over 30,000 tons of bones annually. This was a continent-wide acknowledgement, backed by real economic behavior, that bone was the most reliable phosphate source available to farmers. What killed it was not a better idea. What killed it was a cheaper industrial shortcut and a very deliberate marketing campaign to make you forget that the old way ever existed. In 1842, a British chemist named John Bennett Laws did something that changed the economics of farming forever, and not entirely in the farmer's favor. He discovered that treating raw bones with sulfuric acid dissolved the calcium structure and released phosphorus in a water-soluble form that plants could absorb almost immediately. He called it superphosphate. He patented it, and within a decade, he had built one of the first commercial fertilizer factories in the world at Deptford, on the banks of the Thames. On paper, it sounded like progress. Faster acting, more concentrated, easier to apply. But what Laws had actually created was not just a product, he had created a dependency. For the first time in 8,000 years of farming history, phosphorus nutrition was no longer something a farmer could produce from their own land and their own kitchen. It was something they had to buy from a factory every single season. The fertilizer industry that grew from that single patent is today worth over $200 billion dollars annually, over 200 billion. Dollars. And the foundational business logic has never changed. Take a nutrient that farmers once produced for free from biological waste, process it industrially, and sell it back to them at a margin. The bone meal you buy at your garden center today, that $15 bag, is made from the same raw material your great-grandmother would have roasted in her fire pit and ground with a stone. The difference is a factory, a plastic bag, and a price tag. By the 1950s, as synthetic and processed fertilizers flooded global markets at artificially low prices, subsidized by post-war industrial policy in the United States and Europe, the traditional knowledge of bone preparation quietly disappeared from farming practice. It was not banned. It was not disproven. It was simply drowned out by advertising, made to feel primitive and unnecessary, replaced by the idea that modern farmers buy solutions rather than make them. That forgetting was worth $200 billion a year to someone, and it cost you nothing to unlearn it, except about 10 minutes over a fire. Here is where the science becomes genuinely surprising, because the reason raw bone fails in your garden is not what most people expect. If you take a bone straight from the broth pot and crush it into powder, you will get a material that sits in your soil for months, sometimes years, releasing almost nothing useful to your plants. The reason comes down to a single compound, hydroxyapatite. Hydroxyapatite is the mineral crystal that makes up approximately 70% of the dry weight of any mammal bone. Its chemical formula is Ka10PO4 6OH2, a dense, tightly packed lattice of calcium and phosphate ions bound together in a structure so stable that it survives in archaeological sites for thousands of years without degrading. That stability is exactly what makes raw bone a poor fertilizer. The phosphorus is locked inside a crystalline prison that soil water and plant roots cannot easily penetrate. Even soil bacteria struggle to break it down at any useful speed. But when you place that bone over a charcoal fire and hold it at temperatures between 400 and 700 degrees Celsius for 20 to 30 minutes, something fundamental happens at the molecular level. The heat drives off all residual fat, collagen, and organic protein that coats and fills the gaps between hydroxyapatite crystals. That organic matrix, invisible to the naked eye, is precisely what blocks microbial access to the mineral surface. Once it burns away, the crystal structure becomes porous and exposed, riddled with microscopic channels that bacteria can penetrate directly. Simultaneously, the intense heat causes partial thermal decomposition of the hydroxyapatite lattice itself. Some of the phosphate groups on the outer surface of each crystal shift into a less stable, more reactive configuration, what materials scientists call a metastable phase. This metastable surface is dramatically more soluble than untreated hydroxyapatite, meaning that both soil moisture and microbial enzymes can begin extracting phosphate ions almost immediately upon contact. The specific bacteria responsible for this final step are called phosphate solubilizing bacteria, or PSB, organisms like Bacillus megaterium, Pseudomonas putida, and Aspergillus niger that naturally colonize healthy garden soil. These bacteria secrete organic acids, gluconic acid, citric acid, oxalic acid, that attack the surface of mineral phosphate compounds and pull phosphate ions into soil solution where plant roots can absorb them. In untreated raw bone, PSB activity is minimal because the organic coating blocks contact. In properly roasted bone powder, PSB colonization of the particle surface begins within days of application, and measurable phosphate release into soil solution has been documented in peer-reviewed studies within 2 to 3 weeks. The numbers are significant. A 2019 study published in the journal Applied Soil Ecology measured phosphorus availability from roasted bone powder versus commercial bone meal in tropical garden soil and found that properly roasted home-prepared bone powder released phosphorus at rates within 15% of commercial bone meal over a 60-day period, at a material cost of essentially zero compared to $12 to $18 per kilogram for the commercial product. 15% difference. That is the entire gap between 8,000 years of traditional knowledge and a $200 billion industry. Before you take everything just said and run straight to your charcoal grill with a pot full of bones, there is something important to address honestly, because this channel is not in the business of selling you a fantasy, and any method that cannot acknowledge its own limits is a method you should not trust. Roasted bone powder is not a complete fertilizer. It is a phosphorus and calcium amendment, and a very good one, but it contains almost no nitrogen and negligible potassium. If your soil is deficient across all three major nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, what agronomists call the NPK triangle, bone powder alone will not save your fruit trees. You will see improved flowering and root development because those are phosphorus-driven processes, but you will not see the full explosive growth that comes from a properly balanced soil nutrition program. Bone powder works best as one component of a broader organic system, paired with compost for nitrogen and wood ash or banana peel for potassium. There is also a timing limitation. Because the phosphorus release mechanism depends on microbial activity, roasted bone powder performs significantly better in warm, biologically active soil than in cold or waterlogged conditions. If your soil temperature drops below 15 degrees Celsius, PSB activity slows dramatically and phosphate release can stall for weeks. In tropical and subtropical climates, where most home gardeners growing fruit trees in Vietnam, Southeast Asia, and South America are working, this is rarely a problem. But it is worth knowing. And here is the honest comparison that the fertilizer industry will never put on their packaging. A $15 bag of commercial bone meal gives you approximately 1 kilogram of processed phosphate material with a guaranteed analysis. Your roasted home bone powder gives you a variable product. The phosphorus content depends on which animal the bones came from, how long you roasted them, and how finely you ground them. Pork and beef bones generally contain more phosphorus than chicken bones. Longer roasting at higher temperatures produces more reactive surface area. Finer grinding accelerates microbial access. So yes, commercial bone meal is more standardized. It is more predictable. And it costs $15 every time your trees need feeding. Your kitchen bones cost you nothing. They are available every single week, and with 10 minutes of attention over a fire, they deliver phosphorus nutrition that falls within 15% of what you just paid $15 for. The gap between those two options is not quality, it is convenience. And the century-long marketing campaign that convinced an entire civilization that convenience was worth paying for indefinitely. That is the moment where this becomes more than a gardening tip, because the person who learns to close that gap, who looks at a pot of spent bones and sees a phosphate mine instead of kitchen waste, that person has just stepped outside a $200 billion system that was built on the assumption they would never figure this out. Now, the part you have been waiting for since the first minute of this video, exactly how to turn your kitchen bones into the most effective free phosphate fertilizer your fruit trees have ever received, with nothing more than tools you already own. Start with the bones. Any animal bone works: pork, beef, chicken, duck, lamb. The only bones to avoid are fish bones, which are too fine and too high in salt content from most cooking methods to be reliably useful. Bones that have already been boiled for broth are actually ideal because the long simmering process has already removed the majority of surface fat and marrow grease, which means less work for your fire. Do not worry about small amounts of remaining meat or cartilage. The roasting step will handle all of it. Collect your spent bones in a dry container over the course of a week or two. You do not need a large quantity to start. Even 300 to 500 grams of mixed bones from a single family's weekly cooking is enough to treat 3 to 5 fruit tree bases meaningfully. Once you have a usable pile, spread them in a single layer directly on a charcoal grill, a wood fire grate, or even a dry clay pot set over an open flame. The goal is sustained high heat. You are targeting somewhere between 400 and 600 degrees Celsius, which a healthy charcoal fire reaches easily within 10 minutes of ignition. Leave the bones over the heat for 20 to 30 minutes. You will notice a visible progression. First, any remaining fat will smoke and sizzle off. This is normal and expected. Then the bones will shift from their cooked beige color toward a deeper brown, then gray, then a pale chalky black on the outer surface. That chalky black exterior is your visual confirmation that the thermal decomposition process is complete. The organic matrix has burned away. The hydroxyapatite surface is now exposed and reactive, and your bones are ready. Pull them off the heat and allow them to cool completely on a dry surface. This takes roughly 15 to 20 minutes. Do not rush this step with water because thermal shock can cause the bones to fragment unevenly and lose surface area. Once fully cooled, the bones will feel noticeably lighter than when you started, and they will be genuinely brittle. A pressure between two fingers should crack most pieces without significant effort. Now grind them. A heavy mortar and pestle works well for smaller batches and gives you control over final particle size. A hammer inside a thick cloth bag works for larger bones. If you have access to a cheap electric grain mill or a heavy-duty blender, even better. Finer powder means more surface area for PSB colonization and faster phosphorus release. Your target is a coarse powder, somewhere between coarse sand and talcum powder in texture. You do not need pharmaceutical-grade uniformity. Consistency within that range is sufficient for excellent results. Application is straightforward. For an established fruit tree, citrus, guava, mango, custard apple, long gone, apply 150 to 200 grams of bone powder per tree, distributed in a ring around the drip line of the canopy rather than directly against the trunk. The drip line is where the active feeder roots are concentrated, and that is where you want the phosphorus to be available. Work the powder lightly into the top 2 to 3 centimeters of soil with a hand tool, then water gently but thoroughly. That initial watering activates soil moisture contact with the bone powder surface and begins the PSB colonization process. For seedlings or younger trees under 2 years old, reduce the application to 50 to 80 grams and apply every 6 to 8 weeks during the growing season. For established trees in active fruiting phase, a single application of 150 to 200 grams every 8 to 10 weeks provides sustained phosphorus support through flowering and fruit development. The 2 stages where phosphorus demand spikes most sharply. Expect to see the first visible responses within 3 to 4 weeks in warm, biologically active soil. The earliest signs are not dramatic. A subtle deepening of leaf color as phosphorus supports chlorophyll synthesis, and a slight stiffening of new stem growth as calcium strengthens cell walls. The more spectacular response, heavier flower set and increased fruit retention, typically becomes visible in the season following 2 to 3 applications, as soil phosphorus levels build progressively with each treatment. The total cost of everything described in this entire process, $0. The bones were already paid for when you bought the meat. The fire was already burning when you cooked dinner. The only investment is 10 minutes of attention and the decision to see your kitchen waste as something other than garbage. Compare that to $15 every 8 weeks for a commercial bone meal product applied to 5 fruit trees across a growing season. That is roughly $90 a year, every year, for the rest of the time you grow fruit, against $0. The math is not complicated, but only if someone tells you the math exists. 8,000 years ago, a farmer somewhere in the Fertile Crescent buried a handful of burned animal bones around the roots of a fruit tree and watched it thrive through a dry season that killed everything around it. That farmer told their children. Their children told their grandchildren. The knowledge traveled across continents, survived empires, outlasted civilizations, until 1950, when a fertilizer company with a marketing budget decided it was more profitable for you to forget. You now know what they spent 70 years and $200 billion a year trying to make you overlook. That the bones sitting in your kitchen after Sunday dinner contain more phosphorus than most products on the shelf at your garden center. That 10 minutes over a fire and 5 minutes with a mortar and pestle transforms kitchen waste into one of the most bioavailable phosphate sources your fruit trees can receive. That the $15 bag you have been buying, season after season, is the industrialized version of something your great-grandmother would have made for free without a second thought. This is not just a gardening tip. Every time you roast those bones instead of throwing them away, you are opting out of a system that was engineered to extract money from you in exchange for knowledge that was always rightfully yours. That is worth more than $15. That is worth passing on. If this video reached you at the right moment, if you felt that quiet anger when you understood what has been hidden and why, then do not let it stop here. Share this with one person who grows food, who tends a garden, who is trying to feed their family from their own land without spending money they do not have. Not for this channel, for them. Because this knowledge does not belong to an algorithm. It belongs to anyone with a fire and a handful of bones. And if you want to go deeper, next week this channel is going to investigate something even older and even more suppressed. The ancient practice of fermenting wood ash into a liquid potassium concentrate that outperforms commercial potash fertilizer at a cost of exactly $0, using nothing but rainwater and time. The fertilizer industry has two reasons to hope you never watch that video. Make sure you do.